Okay, I think it should work. Let me admit everyone. Hi everyone. Since it's like the start time right now, we'll probably wait another like 5 minutes or so and then get started. For those of you guys who just joined, I think we're just gonna wait like 2 more minutes and then get started. Yeah. Come over.
Hello, my child.
Hey, Dorina, sorry, I think you're unmuted. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started, and like as people join, I'll just let them into the waiting room. So yeah, this is our topic lecture, the first event of the season. It'll be given by Vikrant and Om, who both go to Lynbrook, and I'll just be like moderating and like making sure y'all are on task, I guess. I can hand it off to y'all now if you want to introduce yourselves and then get started.
Hi, I'm
I'm Vikrant, and
uh
it's the topic
wait
lecture.
one sec, Lori. It says you disabled participation screen sharing.
Oh, sorry, my fault. Let me. Okay, you should be able to share now.
Great. So today we're going to be talking about the wealth tax topic. So the text of the resolution is resolved the United States ought to adopt a wealth tax. Uh,
Wait, Kim.
you want to
Okay,
go
so
over the
yeah,
definitions
I can
or?
go over this one. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think the most important word on this topic is like wealth tax because it's really like the only word that like limits it. Like other stuff, United States, we're obviously going to have the debates we have on every topic. Is the United States the federal government, states, cities, localities, etc.? In this topic, it's probably the federal government because taxation, specifically taxes on like wealth, are usually done by the federal government in most countries empirically. So a wealth tax, what is it? In the US, we currently have income taxes mainly, which are taxes directly on the income you gain at the end of the year. On the other hand, a wealth tax taxes directly from your net worth. For example, if I'm like Jeff Bezos, obviously my salary does not account for all of my money because I also have things like a company, I have stocks. Those like examples of wealth I have are things that are not directly taxed right now, and a wealth tax would be like a direct percentage out of like your total wealth. So on the side here, you see some definitions of like what a wealth tax could be. It could either be a tax on like all of your wealth. For example, like if I had like $300 billion and it was like a 10% tax, it'd just be 10% of that like 300 billion. Or it could be a tax on like specific things. For example, property taxes, we have those in the US already in like states. And those are examples of wealth taxes because like you're not actually getting those each year. Another debate that there is to be had is like whether it can be recycled. And I think Ohm will talk more about like recycling on like the AF side, but it's basically when you use the money that you gain from the wealth tax to like pay for something else. So the other parts of the topic are like adopt. Probably does not mean a lot on this topic. It's just kind of the word we always have like some word on like implementing the resolution, like guarantee or like require, etc. It probably just means policy. Taxes, the wealth tax is probably a progressive tax. So the way taxes work is either like if you have more, you pay more taxes, which is a progressive tax, or some taxes, if you're poorer, you pay more taxes, which is a regressive tax, which you probably won't have. Last, wealth tax, wealth and wealth tax. It probably means all of your wealth. but like wealth tax is a specific term, which means like it might come first. And last, wealth tax is kind of a vague term, which means we might have the same spec debates we have on every topic, where the negative can be procedurals, like you have to specify what a wealth tax is. Okay.
Okay, next we're going to talk about the affirmative on this topic. So there are a number of advantages that affirmatives that defend the whole resolution that the United States ought to adopt a wealth tax could read. One of these, which was recently read at the Florida Blue Key tournament, was the inequality advantage. You guys might have heard debates on the living wage topic about inequality, and a lot of those same cards about inequality being high now would apply here. There are a lot of good articles that explain why after COVID, there's a lot of income inequality and just inequality broadly in terms of like people's access to the economy. When you're reading like cards about inequality, though, you want to make sure that you avoid ones that might be related to wages, since remember, a wealth tax is solely about the amount of wealth someone has and not the amount of income somebody might have. The solvent this you can see from the West 24 card at the top. It cites like statistics that say like the top 10% earned 48% of the income by 2023, which is a substantial increase from the 34% they earned in 1976, which is especially harmful for underrepresented ethnic or racial groups. That would be an example of uniqueness evidence you might read for that advantage. Next would be solvency. So a wealth tax would obviously close the gap between the wealth and the poor, or the wealthy and the poor. It would reduce the amount of wealth that rich people can hoard in bank accounts and things like that. And revenue recycling into things like benefits programs like Medicaid, Social Security, or other new programs like UBI or something like that would decrease inequality by giving people like the money they need in order to get a job and in order to participate in the economy. As the West and Marty 23 cards both show, income inequality is primarily caused by wealthy people being able to evade taxes. You might have heard of like companies setting up like in like the Caribbean or wealthy people putting their money into tax havens or the other things like art or the stock market, which enables them to keep billions of dollars in like fund billions of dollars in money away from taxes, which prevents the government from being able to fund lots of programs that benefit poor people. For the impact, you want to check a lot of living wage apps. There's impacts like elite capture, which you might have seen with the Schmidt card, or diversionary war, which there's like cards like Long, or there's a few more that say that income inequality can cause like diversionary wars or nationalism. There's also a variety of economy-related impacts you can read, like income inequality or inequality broadly leads to people not participating as much in the economy, leads to trade collapse, debt, etc. As a result of the vast variety of impacts and link turns you can read, this advantage is one of the most strategic ones on this topic since it link turns a lot of the core DAs like the econ DA, which Vikrant's going to talk about later. It also has relatively true-ish uniqueness and solvency, but the issue with it is that the terminal impact of things like elite capture or diversionary wars are usually fake and turned by disads, since obviously if the economy collapses, that's going to be way worse for inequality than the wealth tax is going to be able to prevent. Additionally, something like inequality is a relatively slow impact, so you might want to pair this with another faster impact so that you can beat arguments like time frame outweighs. So does anybody have any questions about the inequality advantage in particular, about how it solves or what the impact might look like? If there's no questions, I'll move on to the next advantage. Yeah, I don't think there's any questions. Wait, is there something in the chat? Why does time frame outweigh in this case? So that's a great question. In this case, time frame for an argument like the economy disad versus disaf would certainly outweigh. Solving things like inequality takes a really long time to occur because benefits programs take like years to actually be effective after funding is increased, and the tax itself might take years to actually implement and be able to take money from the wealthy, where something like the perceptual shock in the stock market or something like capital flight, which Vikrant's going to cover later, is much faster for most econ decides. So for those scenarios, it would be much faster than the solvency is for inequality. In these kinds of cases, I would recommend going for something like probability outweighs so that you can like be able to beat time frame because generally the econ DA is going to be faster than this. That's a great question. Are there any others? No? Okay. The next advantage, which was also read at the Florida Blue Key tournament, was the debt advantage. So obviously, you guys might have heard that the national debt is very high. It's around $34 trillion right now. If you want more uniqueness evidence besides the SOAR 28.4 evidence, you can look at arguments from last year, like the rescissions counterplan, or apps that were read in high school policy debate. There are a lot of advantages about debt being high now, and I'm sure you can find some that might be written more recently too, especially with recent government funding programs being launched. Debt being really high is an issue that a wealth tax might be able to solve. Wealth tax would do a couple of things, which you might see in this Singer evidence down here. It would, as mentioned previously, the revenue used could not only fund these programs, but could also be used to pay off the national debt, whether that be paying back bonds or loans we've taken from other countries. But more importantly, it would reform the tax code. The Singer 21 evidence says that things like loopholes like the carried interest loopholes or broad other forms of tax loopholes currently exist because broader tax legislation reform hasn't passed. But the passage of a wealth tax would help reform that and influence future legislation so that the government can continue taxing corporations and people in order to get more revenue. There's also other solvency arguments about other forms of capital that the wealth tax would be able to access, such as unrealized capital gains that a lot of wealthy people invest in so that they can avoid paying taxes. The impact to debt is usually the debt to GDP ratio being too high, which causes the US to do things like default on debt and results in collapse of trade and means that we can't have government funding to fight wars or solve other issues, such as like inequality or fighting wars with China or Russia, etc. The main pro with this advantage is that it kind of turns the economy advantage because obviously if you're winning, that debt is going to result in economic collapse. That's going to like obviously turn the economy advantage and prove that their impact is inevitable absent you doing a wealth tax. The cons is that debt as a whole is a pretty fake impact. We've had a high national debt for like decades, and it's not freaked out a lot of governments because no country defaults on debt usually. It's also very slow impact. No impact card that I've read or uniqueness evidence says when will default or how it's going to occur. And there are obviously advantage counterplans like other forms of taxation or cutting parts of the government that would be able to solve for us spending a lot of money. Um, and obviously, like these advantage counterplans, you might have seen some on living wage, where other people also read similar debt advantages. So you might want to look at those too. Does anybody have questions about the debt advantage? How do you respond to arguments like the loopholes would happen anyway? Just fiat it. So in other parts of the Singer card and at the bottom, like right here, it says that like the examples of loopholes is the example it gives is like carried interest, which permits investment fund managers to pay lower tax. A wealth tax would solve that because you would tax investment fund managers the same amount or higher amounts. There are also other forms of loopholes like ca unrealized capital gains, which again, a wealth tax would solve. And there's also like a follow-on argument in Singer that says that like future legislation and future tax reforms would be much greater after we pass a massive form of legislation like a wealth tax. For example, going back to like the 1900s, after we passed the income tax, a couple of decades later, we got a bunch of new government programs like the New Deal. This probably wouldn't have existed if we didn't have an income tax passed beforehand. So you can make an argument that something similar might happen and reform the tax code later. But yeah, generally you'd fiat through those loopholes and argue that like future policies would solve. How does it turn econ? Sure. So the argument for why it turns the economy dissad is pretty simple. It's just that debt is going to result in economic collapse inevitably, whether that's in this year, 5 years, or 10 years, which means that structurally the impact of economy is inevitable because when debt collapses and we default on all of our loans, that causes a global financial crisis. Reducing debt would solve that because it would obviously mean that there's no future debt collapse, so it solves for the most probable cause of a future economic crash. Let me see if there's any other questions. Uh, I don't think there are any. If anybody has, feel free to ask now. Otherwise, I'll move on. Okay. The next advantage is the climate advantage. You might have seen this also read at Florida Blue Key. The uniqueness for this is pretty simple. ever since like Biden came into office, and besides the Inflation Reduction Act, the US action on climate has been really, really small. And whatever action has happened isn't really affecting like the economy. We aren't doing like bans on extraction of fossil fuels or like taxes or anything like that. And as a result, other countries like China, Russia, countries in the EU, India, etc., are all slowing down their action because if the US isn't doing anything, why should other countries do the same or like do anything that might harm their economy? The solvency for this is that a climate wealth tax would discourage investment in carbon industries. This is an example of a plan-specific advantage, namely that you would read an advocacy that's the United States ought to adopt a climate wealth tax, and then that would result in us taxing carbon-intensive industries like coal, fossil fuel industries, or like other industries like manufacturing that might cause a lot of carbon emissions. That would do a couple of things. It would discourage investment there and would also, as a result, hedge against carbon bubbles. Carbon bubbles are basically industries that have artificially inflated due to the overuse of carbon emissions. But in the future, once we start decreasing use of emissions, inevitably those bubbles are going to pop and cause economic crises. So if we discourage investment now before those bubbles get too big, we can solve those economic crises before they happen while also preventing climate change. If you look at the cards I have to the right here, there's an example of the FATCA, which provides an example of how the US doing a wealth tax might spill over globally. Since when the US imposed a tax on all interest paid to uncooperative banks, the EU also did the same. And the OECD also developed some other protocols in line with the US's tax, and such a unilateral approach would be sufficient to solve and spill over to other countries. It would also, as the card I on the top right mentions, would directly tackle the polluting asset, which means it would directly tax the pollution instead of tackling the result of those pollutions, like carbon pricing or other programs like cap and trade might. So the impact of this, pretty simple. Climate change is bad. It causes food insecurity, resource wars, nationalism, probably causes other crises too. If you read impact cards like the Kemp 23 evidence that you might have seen read last topic, the economic crises caused by things like carbon bubbles and climate change would also cause war. The NEG usually reads a card for this, like the economy dissad. So you can straight turn this in the 1AC itself and read an economy advantage, which would help you get ground on that argument before the 1AC is even started. And you can read arguments as to why an economic crisis would be bad for not just causing war, but also causing more populism. There are a lot of pros to this advantage. Namely, the plan text itself being only a climate wealth tax allows you to specify out of broader disad links, and it also enables you to have multiple impacts like climate change and war. The cons to this are that people can read topicality arguments like must defend all assets being taxed, like T subsets, and they can also reuse carbon tax prep to respond to this, mainly like all of the camp prep we did or the prep you might have done for September, October about why taxing carbon and taxing carbon intensive industries is bad might be able to be reused versus this. There's also a good argument about why this might not spill over, especially to countries like China and Russia. So there's no way the US can solve for climate change globally. So does anybody have any questions about this advantage and like what the plan might look like? What would it do to solve climate change? What are some defense to topicality in this specific case, like aside from the generics? So generally for topicality, you're going to want a few things. First, you want like a counterinterp, like you might have seen on the definitions slide, there was like a definition that said a wealth tax could apply to some or all assets. So you want a definition. You want, in this case versus T subsets, you want an argument that's like every AF under our interp is a pick under theirs. So even if we can't read the climate wealth tax AF, they would read the climate wealth tax pick, which is worse because being AF is hard and the 1AR is specifically hard. You also want defense to their arguments, like generics. You can read like K's, disads, and with contextual links, process counterplans, etc. Or like there's always functional limits on the topic. Apps need a reason why the wealth tax is key. Otherwise, they just lose to like capital income tax counterplan. And you can also argue reasonability. All of those are good responses. But if you want to go more in depth with Tia, I'd recommend like talking about it with your mentor. What's the best answer against no modeling, just better evidence? Well, usually the 1AC needs evidence that like past examples of taxes have spilled over and evidence contextual to a wealth tax that says that will spill over. those cards have been read. Like the card at the bottom right says a unilateral approach could work. But generally, like my best advice would be to read some kind of scenario that would be US specific, like carbon bubbles, so that worst case, if they really do go all in on no modeling, you can just go for a US contextual scenario, like carbon bubbles or like economic crises or climate emissions in the US causing something. Okay. Any last questions before I move on to the next advantage? No? All right. Next is a non-extinction advantage. It's the Reparations Act. You might have seen this read by Harris Layson at the FBK Florida Blue Key tournament. The uniqueness is pretty simple. There's been a racial wealth gap ever since the United States was created, but it's been widening pretty recently. This is rooted in things like colonialism and slavery. Like even after slavery ended, there were a lot of laws that prevented minority groups from being able to access the same economic opportunities like equal work or equal pay that white people were able to access. And as a result, there was a massive racial wealth gap that prevented them from being able to access like the same degree of like healthcare or same quality of life that white people could. The solvency for this is that the plan and a wealth tax would enable wealth redistribution to disadvantaged minorities. The plan would take money away from the wealthy and redistribute it in the form of benefits programs or other things to the poor. Those poor people are usually minorities as a result of like the racial wealth gap and other issues in society today. This would not only address societal problems like the racial wealth gap, but it would also help like prevent things like inequality, and it would help solve an instance of structural racism or violence. The impact of this is pretty simple. It's just a standard structural violence impact. You should have some framing in the 1AC as to why structural racism and violence that exists in society should outweigh extinction, such as like you shouldn't consider future generations, structural violence outweighs on probability, and you should weigh probability first, framing arguments like that. Some pros of this are that you can frame the debate through simply just through extinction outweighs. If you win that extinction doesn't outweigh, you pretty much generally win the debate because they won't really have good case turns or arguments like that because the 2NR has to be split between the dissad and the framing. The cons of this is that extinction outweighs is pretty good argument, and there's also a good case of reparations that you might have seen broken against debaters who read this app. So not only do you still have to handle case and other arguments like that, but you still have to answer the hard right angle of extinction outweighs plus a dissad. And to the right, you can see some cards that were read by debaters who read this app. Reparations are a form of climate justice. So you might read this with a climate wealth tax app, or you can just read it with a standard whole resolution app and argue that cash alone doesn't suffice, and therefore we need better federal programs like insurance and Medicare, Social Security, etc. Does anybody have questions about wealth or about reparations and what framing arguments you might use, things like that? What are some responses to this app that's not K or extinction based? You can argue that a wealth tax and redistribution would be worse for minority groups. There's probably some case turns out there about like
I'll talk
increasing
about those.
dependence on.
Wait, I have stuff on that in like the other section.
Oh, okay, yeah. So Vikrant
Yeah.
was going to cover that later, probably stuff about like increasing dependence bad. So he'll cover it later on his part. What are good framing arguments against K's like set, call, and cap? When you're reading this app, you generally want to go for some kind of link turn strategy versus both of those K's. Argue that materialism is good, and even if the plan isn't perfect, it's a step in the right direction. You also want to make arguments as to why like decreasing the racial wealth cap is a prerequisite to doing an alternative of like decall or whatever the cap all is, because people need money before they can participate in these movements. So generally, you just gonna want to go for like the plan is an instance of progress that is good and key to addressing whatever harms the K thinks are bad, and therefore like it's a link turn, and you want to go for permutation, do both. The link turn is a net benefit to that perm. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so next, just briefly, Kant app. We haven't really covered Phil that much yet, but Generally, what Kant says is that freedom violations are the only constitutive obligation we have. They're the only obligation that applies to everybody, since everybody is a reasoner, which justifies the creation of an omnilateral will, which this card explains a bit more in depth at the top right. So the offense for a Kant F would be that the omnilateral will and the government that's created to enforce freedom on people would require taxation and redistribution. Redistribution would also be a prerequisite to individual freedom, which this card at the bottom right, which was read by a PepTalk board member critique at the Florida Blue Key tournament, says like redistribution is internal to the idea that acquisition must be authorized and that wealth solely exists through the exclusion of others from their goods, which is bad under Kant. Some pros for this is that Kant plus advantage is pretty strategic af, and people don't really know how to respond. Cons are that generally the straight ref is very good. People can argue for why like taxes are bad under Kant and like why wealth taxes uniquely are bad compared to things like income taxes. So they can argue that even though taxation generally might be good, a wealth tax would specifically be bad under Kant. And a lot of judges are very good for arguments like extinction outweighs, util, or a critique of Kant, which might be a challenge for people reading this app. Finally, I'll just briefly go over or actually, wait, does anybody have questions about Kant? This might be a bit confusing now, but I'm sure we'll have some kind of Phil lecture later or like debate later in which we can go over more in depth. What's the bright line in this case? When it be reduced to consequentialism because you need to use consequences to determine where the bright line of the tax is? Well, Kant really doesn't care about what the consequences of the tax are. What a Kantian framework would just say is that the idea or the maxim of a wealth tax is good because it results in redistribution or not because it results, but because an intrinsic characteristic of a wealth tax would be redistributing wealth from the wealthy to the poor. So it doesn't matter how much the wealth tax is. It just matters that as a maxim, it would be a good thing and like prevent coercion or other violations of freedom. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Briefly, some non-topical AF ideas. Generally, this AFs on this topic can redefine wealth or wealth tax or just tax itself. Some definitions of wealth might be that all wealth is land, so an advocacy about giving land back might be topical, which is what this Tuck and Yang card at the top right says, since like land, the wealth is only created through through stolen land. You could also argue that wealth is knowledge or knowledge production, and write an app about the way we understand knowledge production in debate or contextualized to this topic. Tax, you could argue that tax means eliminate or destroy. So an advocacy about revolting against the wealth, i.e. a cap F, might be topical, or redefine United States as the land and assemblage, the undercommons, etc. There's not much for adopt, since as mentioned previously, that generally means to enact by law. Also, obviously, generic chaos like race war or something like that would always be viable, and you can just recycle blocks from previous topics. I don't think there are many pros of reading apps like this, and obviously the cons would be that you violate topicality, you have to deal with method debates like K's, picks, and still link to a lot of disads about why hedge or cap might be good. Um, yeah. There's also like obviously the card at the bottom right is a redefinition of United States, and you can redefine it as this card mentions about the land, and read it after about giving the land back as an advocacy. Does anybody have questions about non-topical apps and like what they might look like on this topic? All right. If there are no questions, I'll hand it to Vikrant to start with the neg. No, I don't think there are any questions.
I think you had another slide that you added. I think you forgot one.
Oh, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, shoot, 1AR strategy. My bad. Okay, briefly, 1AR strategy. Generally, when reading most policy apps, the angle versus disads should primarily be link-related arguments like link defense or link turns. Most uniqueness arguments flow neg right now. Like inflation is low, the economy is doing well, the job market's pretty good. As a result, your main angle versus these disads should just be case outweighs plus no link or link turn. You also pretty importantly need to weigh a lot in the two-error and answer their weighing arguments like link turns case or DA turns case and things like that, because those are some of the most strategic arguments that they can make. Also, always make sure you have some kind of like meta weighing in the two-error about what probability or time frame outweighs, depending on what advantage or scenario you're reading, and try to contextualize it the most to whatever impact you have, like climate change, inequality, etc. Advantage counterplans are pretty scary on this topic, especially with most the advantages most people are reading. Your 1AC should be built to have reasons why a wealth tax is good and why each aspect of it, i.e., tax on all assets, tax on specific parts of assets, like why a tax is key, etc., why an income tax expansion doesn't work. As a result, there might be advantage counterplans that are just picks out of certain parts, like a capital income tax counterplan or a pick out of real estate and argue that why the pick solves case and have a dissad as to why like real estate taxation might be bad or why unrealized capital gains taxes might be bad. Process counterplans on this topic, you want to make sure to work on counterplan competition because that's always a viable two-error, especially given like vagueness of what a wealth tax is, like how it might be implemented. Certainty key, probably a good argument on a tax topic. People really don't know how laws work. Obviously, if you did a law through or did a tax through the 50 states all stopping all federal funding until the federal government did a tax, that would probably not be certain. So you want to have some kind of deficit for why people would understand the tax or why that's key in your 1AC, especially if you're reading an advantage about something like inequality or consumer spending. K's, generally, there's going to be two types of links. Links that the AF link turns, i.e. arguments about the status quo that say there's like issues in the status quo, which a wealth tax probably resolves, since taxation of the wealthy and redistribution to the poor is probably a good thing for most minority groups. Links that the AF doesn't link turn, i.e. like I can't think of one off the top of my head, but something like argument about why a wealth tax like results in people like not wanting to participate in movements should generally be impact turned through arguments like cap good or hedge good. But generally, like the case on this topic are not going to be that good because that wealth tax is generally a good idea for most minority groups. Uh, yeah, that's all for app stuff. I'll hand it to Vikrant to talk about neg strategy now.
Okay, guys, I'm gonna be going over the negative now. Oh, can you go to slide? Okay. Okay, so on this topic, the very, very biggest piece of negative ground is going to be the econ DA. And I think if you're debating, like on whatever circuit you're debating on, you're going to be seeing this very, very often because it interacts very, very well with all of the arguments the AF talks about, things like reparations, things like inequality, things like debt. All of these things interact very directly with the economy. Something you might have noticed in the AF section is that the AF always wants to see their thing turns the economy. There's a reason for that. It's because every AF on this topic is kind of built to try to beat the economy DA because it's really, really good. So the basic structure of the econ DA is there's three parts. First, uniqueness. And I think Ohm just talked about this, where the economy is doing really well right now. We've had things like rate cuts, like everyone's really optimistic. Businesses are really confident that growth is going to continue. The stock market is like doing the best it's had like in ages. And in general, everybody thinks it's like really good. The link, I'm going to talk about this more later, but in general, there's a ton of reasons why the plan would be very quickly bad for the economy. A lot of the stuff on inequality relies on saying it would be like good in the long term. However, there's a really big chance that the AF might immediately crash the economy, which could have some issues. In terms of impacts, the most common impacts you'll see for the economy DA is that it causes war. There's a lot of really good cards on this. The Young card is from 2024 and cites like 2 decades of stuff of economy causing war. And it's also and again, it also turns the AF, for example, things like inequality. Okay, so I'm gonna be going over like all the specific arguments for why the AF hurts the economy now. So I think by far the best argument for why the AF hurts the economy is it causes capital flight. Essentially, what capital flight is that when companies see something bad happen within the US that would hurt their own business, they think they should go to a different country where things are easier. I think already talked about this, where in the status quo, companies will go to what are called tax havens, which are countries with very low, which are have very low taxes, which makes it easier for them to like build more wealth. The argument here is that a wealth tax would massively exacerbate this because it would cause the richest companies to have to pay far more taxes, which means that they would like have less of a reason to be in the US. And I think the evidence that kind of everybody's been reading is in the top right. It's the Enoch evidence. And it says that like taxes would discourage companies from staying in the US. They go to like somewhere where there's like less wealth taxes, which is also a reason why a lot of countries that already implemented wealth taxes repealed their wealth taxes because they thought it was hurting their own economy. So the second link that's really good is the business confidence link. And this one's just perceptual. Even if a wealth tax would be good for the economy in a vacuum, the argument is that companies would feel like a wealth tax would hurt them, which would cause them to like freak out and would hurt what's called like their business confidence, which is like a metric we use to like determine like how confident companies are that the economy will like work out for them. That would actually, and what the argument is that when companies become less confident, we'd like kind of talk ourselves into a recession. Companies would make decisions that are more defensive, so they would like not go bankrupt instead of like trying to actually increase the economy, which would hurt the economy broadly. Another link is like the liquidity link. So if you think about a wealth tax in terms of compared to an income tax only taxes the actual income you have in terms of like dollars that you get at the end of the year, which makes it really easy for you to pay an income tax. Because, for example, if my salary is like 100K and the income tax is $10, 10%, I could just pay 10K because I got that money. On the other hand, with a wealth tax, not all of the wealth I own, for example, is in like, not all the wealth I own is in money. For example, if most of my wealth is in homes or land or like stocks, for me to be able to pay the wealth tax, I would have to sell some of that for me to be able to pay for the wealth tax, which is really difficult because those things aren't perfectly liquid. It's really hard for you to immediately turn that in like the snap of your fingers into actual wealth, which would make it really hard for businesses to run. Another thing is this like calculation argument. For obviously it's not that easy to calculate how much wealth you have exactly, which means it would be hard for the IRS, which actually calculate these taxes. It would also be hard for people to calculate it. And that's also says that's why previous countries stop having their wealth taxes. In general, I'm going to talk. There's more on another slide, but the best angle against this is probably like Ohm talked about, like a specific AF that taxes like a specific sector. For example, the climate wealth AF says that we should only tax like climate wealth, which is probably has a better angle because it wouldn't have to affect the entire economy. But I think even against those like really small AFs, it's really good because things like perception, confidence would still cause an economic decline. Yeah. Okay, here's like four more arguments that I think are all really good. Okay, the first one in the top left is the stock market argument. The argument is that if we had a wealth tax, it would hurt the stock market because your stocks are not some if when we enter the tax season and a ton of people would suddenly have to pay their taxes, they would be like, okay, now we all have to sell our stocks at the exact same time. So people who could benefit off of that by realizing that people would all sell their stocks and take advantage of it, and that would distort the stock market. And people would be forced to sell their assets in a time that doesn't really make a lot of sense. When in the status quo, if you just don't sell your stocks, you don't get income for them, which means that you wouldn't have to, if you don't sell your stocks, you don't get income from them, which means you wouldn't get taxed. And this also ties into this argument of double taxation, where the wealth, when you turn that wealth into income later, for example, when you sell your stocks and it goes into your income, that in the status quo is taxed. But if you tax the stock and you tax the stock after it's been turned into wealth, you've taxed it twice, which means that people can lose a lot of money. Bottom left is the liquidity argument from the last slide, and like top right is too. And then the last argument in the corner is this argument about confidence, where companies would feel really unconfident in the economy if they felt that like everything that they did was being taxed a ton. They'd have less of an incentive to actually invest in their companies. And there's other piece of evidence, like the one on the top right, that says it would reduce their incentive to increase wages, it might lower wages, it might lower productivity broadly, which would hurt the economy. Okay, so what questions does anybody have on the economy DA? Okay. Um, okay. The next TA is the IRS TA. So the IRS is like the revenue service, which like the Internal Revenue Service, which collects taxes each year, and their job would have to be to administer the wealth tax. And so the IRSDA says that when would have a wealth tax, it would put a large strain onto the IRS because they would be forced to pay for the wealth, because they would be forced to like pay for all the resources to actually administer it. They'd have to hunt down people who want to evade the taxes. They would have to like set up new protocols for valuing the taxes. And that would cost a lot of money. This York evidence on the side says that the status quo we want when we try to pass wealth tax legislation, like we've allocated $100 billion for like our proposal for how to implement a wealth tax. And the York evidence says that even if we allocated $100 billion into wealth tax, into like trying to fund a wealth tax, it would not be enough for us to be able to properly enforce it. The main argument for this is that like it's not fully clear how we would value a wealth tax. It would take a ton of resources for us to every year recalculate how much like wealth is worth, how much land is worth, etc., which cost a ton, and that would hurt the IRS. There's a few arguments for why this is bad. First, all these arguments agree that it would like disrupt the IRS, it would take up their time. So the first impact is like a government credibility impact. It says that if we collapse the IRS, it would hurt trust in the government, because we all, even if we don't like taxes, we agree that like taxes or something that kind of like show the government is like functioning properly. If the IRS got completely shut down, that would hurt the ability of the government to properly function, which means that like the people lose trust, and lack of trust makes it hard for us to fight things like climate change. It could also turn inequality impacts into 1AC. When the AF says like we need to fight inequality, it requires people to trust the government that's fighting inequality. It hurts that. There's also another impact that some people are reading about cryptocurrency that says the IRS is regulating cryptocurrency right now. And if they were to focus on a wealth tax, they wouldn't be able to they wouldn't be able to regulate cryptocurrency, which would hurt them. Additionally, it probably turns the case if it's impossible for us to be able to actually regulate, if there's possible for the IRS to actually collect taxes, then you wouldn't actually get any of the benefits of a wealth tax. So the biggest issue with this disad is that just fiating the AF questionably solves the disad. The argument the AF would make in response is just that when we do the AF, the IRS would just get extra resources to do the AF. That would be part of what doing the AF would do, meaning that like there's not really a link to it. But on the other hand, I think this argument isn't like unbeatable. This York evidence says that even if we did allocate additional resources, it wouldn't be enough. And I think an argument you can make is that even if we did allocate extra resources, like we allocated like $1 trillion to the IRS or something to pay for the wealth tax, that would actually hurt the economy, which gives you like a new link back to the other disad. And like historically, we've seen IRSTAs on past topics. For example, on the topic we just had on the living wage topic, there was an AF that Marlborough was reading that defended attacks, and people made arguments of like made an IRSDA, and it was mostly fine. And there's also a high school policy topic about like redistribution where every AF did taxes. It's also pretty good. And this ad also has like other tax evasion arguments where it's like even it would be hard for the IRS to be able to hunt down tax evasion, which would allow for many of the loopholes to continue. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about what the IRSTA is? Like anything about it? Okay. Okay, so the electoral spending DA, I think earlier when Ohm was talking about like soft left AFs, like the reparations AF, and what you can say for like what a wealth tax would do towards reparation, why a wealth tax for reparations would be bad without going for extinction outweighs, this could be an argument for it. So the argument is that when we have a wealth tax, before each tax season, rich people, billionaires would say, okay, I don't want to pay all of these taxes. So instead, I'll spend a bunch of my money so that I can like actually get something out of that money instead of it all being taxed away. And it has this use it or lose it pressure. So the argument is that if we had a wealth tax, instead of that money actually being like taxed away, that money would instead be used by billionaires to like donate to electoral candidates. For example, like in elections, people billionaires have a super disproportionate influence, and that would only increase if we had a wealth tax because they would be paying for like the biggest candidates, and that might increase inequality because companies that are because these candidates would pay to help candidates who would help big business instead of helping the average person with inequality, and that could also increase inequality because those candidates obviously don't like the common person, might hurt democracy because like people like individual people would have less power compared to the billionaires who are massively increasing their amount of taxation. The only issue with this is that when you say a wealth tax causes people to use or lose like their money, the risk with this is it can also be an half argument for the economy, where if people are decide that they if billionaires want to use their are forced to use their money or get it taxed away, it might drive the economy forward because they would invest it instead of just sitting onto it, which might help the economy. So this disad might be a little risky, but in terms of like pros of it, it can definitely help fight against some of these soft left drafts. But then again, the impacts aren't super great. It probably doesn't massively increase inequality. And especially when the election is just about to happen, the impact probably won't be at least until like the next midterms. And definitely like the next presidential election is like 4 years from now. So it's not a super big deal. Uh, okay. Kind of like the opposite of the last argument of instead the philanthropy DA says says that instead of people increasing their spending, it would cause them to reduce their spending, but it would cause them to reduce the amount of good spending they would do. So this in this piece of evidence, it says in the status quo, rich people spend a lot of their money on philanthropy. They like donate to like charitable organizations, they help the average person, which is reducing inequality right now. But if we had a wealth tax, billionaires would feel like they're already being forced to help the average person through things like donations, which means that they're less likely for us to actually be able to help inequality, which in the long term would end up being worse. This is also an argument you can read versus like these smaller apps like reparations and can apply to any app, even small apps. For example, any app would tax the rich. So to the extent that the app taxes the rich, those people would be donating less to philanthropy. It's like would be donating less, which would hurt the amount of inequality they're breaking down. Again, this is probably better as a case turn than its own disad because there's not really that much of an impact to like charity being that good. And it's probably just like a reason why the app solves this. Does anyone have any questions on this one or the last? Okay. Okay. So this one is a little funny. I don't think it's the most strategic argument, but you might have seen Straight Jesuit read it at the Florida Blue Key tournament. The argument is that a wealth tax would hurt private space exploration because it means this it would hurt private space exploration because space exploration is led primarily by companies that have a lot of money, Blue Origin, SpaceX, etc. Even if they're funded by the government, they need a lot of initial funding, which means that a wealth tax would mean the people who own these companies, like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, would be less incentivized to invest into outer space because it would cost them they would have less expendable money to spend on it. However, there's some pretty big issues with this disad. The first thing is that it's pretty similar to the econ DA because it has the same link argument, one of the same link arguments, which is that when we increase SpaceX, which is that it would reduce private investment, which means that even if you're kind of going for this as like a surprise strategy against somebody who's not really ready for it, the other person will like probably like have answers to the idea that like a living wage hurts investment. Additionally, I think the uniqueness isn't super great. I don't think there's a ton of amazing evidence that says like we're going to solve space exploration now, even with like a ton of private investment. And if anything, like other countries or like the private or the public sector could solve space exploration on their own if the private sector doesn't pick it up. Time frame really far in the future, even at the fastest pace, it probably won't be another like 20 years or 10 years. 10 years if like we're being super generous until we like actually start space exploration. So it's probably not great. Again, space colonization bad. Also super threatening argument And it's really scary because if you throw out this dissad as just like a random time suck argument, they could always just impact turn it, and then you're stuck with this dissad. There's arguments about how space exploration would cause like resource wars in space, or like even like alien contact, which is like again not an amazing argument, but this argument is not amazing either. So it can kind of just like be a wash. Okay. Okay. So I think something Ohm talked about earlier was how good advantage counterplans are in this topic. So for those of you guys who don't know, an advantage counterplan is like a counterplan that solves the case, well, not resulting in something that's very similar to the case. It's usually something that's completely different, but allows you to like avoid a DA. And I think that the core topic counterplan on this topic is the income tax counterplan, where instead of implementing a wealth tax, we would increase the current income taxes, which are the taxes we have right now. And the benefit to implementing an income tax compared to benefit of comparing income tax compared to a wealth tax would be that it would be better for the economy or for the IRS. First, in terms of the economy, it would not tax unrealized gains. For example, the stuff I said, where things like stocks, which I've not cashed out yet, those would not be taxed under a world of an income tax, but they would be taxed under a wealth tax. Being taxed on things twice, once when they're wealth and once when you turn them into income, massively disincentivizes investment. So only having an income tax might solve better. Again, it also solves the IRSDA because it doesn't create a new tax, it just expands existing taxes, which is far easier, especially since a lot of the evidence talks about how the IRS knows how income taxes works, but it doesn't know very well how wealth taxes work, which makes it easier for them to be able to which makes it easier for them to be administered. And I think something that like you'll notice when you're reading a lot of people's apps is apps do not have reasons why wealth taxes are key. For example, an advantage I saw this weekend about debt, for example, it was an entire advantage about debt. And there's not a single card that says a wealth tax would solve debt. It just says taxes solve debt. And I think, especially as the topic goes along and people start reading more and more apps, I have a feeling that a lot of them will say why a wealth tax is specifically key compared to other types of taxes, which means an income tax counterplan can really help you mitigate against a lot of these new apps that'll start being broken. Additionally, a lot of the counterplans you saw on the living wage topic, I think these topics are pretty similar in terms of the negative ground. And so a lot of the counterplans you'll see are similar too. For example, the earned income tax credit counterplan that increases like the amount of like tax credits you for poor people get, the amount of tax credits poor people get would help them like fight against inequality. Wage increases, just like bring back your AF from your last topic as a counterplan on this topic, would help fight back against inequality, especially since a lot of AF cards, like Owen talked about, people might accidentally read cards that say there's a lot of wage inequality, income inequality happening right now, which means wages would solve that. Last is the campaign finance counterplan. So the argument here is that in the status quo, inequality is driven by campaigning and like poor politicians deciding what the government would do. For example, people donate billions of dollars to the government so that their favorite politicians can get elected. Those politicians do things that don't help poor people. And because of that, like it drives structural inequality. You would say that changing the way we like finance campaigns would allow us to fight inequality. And so the argument here is that instead of like solving individual instances of inequality, we should solve the structural issues that are causing inequality and would also help avoid disadvantages like the Econ DA or the IRS DA because you don't implement new taxes. Does anyone have questions about any of the counter plans? Okay. How does the income Okay, how does the income tax counterplan work with the stock market DA? So I would say the income tax counterplan and the stock market DA are not incompatible because the stocks are not taxed as income. So income stocks only become income once you sell the stocks and you get them as income. The argument is that the stock market DA's argument is that under a wealth tax, you would be forced to sell your stocks to pay your wealth, to pay the wealth tax. However, under an income tax, you could just shoot if you wanted to, you could never sell your stocks and you would never get taxed on them. And you would only get taxed on them once you sell them, which means you could pay the tax at the time where it's convenient for you or helpful instead of just like paying it when you're forced to. Does anybody else have questions or do you want further clarification on that? Did that make sense? Um, okay, if nobody has any more questions, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so in terms of process counter plans, which are like counter plans that like try to result in the F and try to solve most of it by doing something similar to it, I think most of them will compete off like the word adopt in the resolution, which is like a pretty processy word for like what the resolution will do. I think a lot of the definitions say adopt must involve the Congress must at least involve Congress or like being implemented into law, which means counterplans like the court's counterplan, like the signing statement's counterplan, if any of you guys know what that is, might compete on this topic because they don't involve the Congress. They're a counterplan that would only involve other branches of the government. Additionally, there's definitions that say adopting something must be certain or you must immediately adopt something, which is distinct from a counterplan that might say we should like condition when we do a wealth tax, or we should only do it in the future, which could help. This also means a lot of the counterplans you see on every topic that compete off of immediacy or certainty. For example, like conditions counterplans, um, like counterplans like uncooperative federalism, which is a counterplan that says the states should like force the government to do the plan. Counterplans like that, which are like a bit weird, probably will continue to compete on the topic. Words like resolved, ought, the usual will all still exist, which means that like you'll probably have to be used to that. Something that's really specifically good on this topic, but and it's kind of random that you probably might not have seen before, is the unrepealability counterplan or the sunsets counterplan, which is a counterplan that says we should do the plan, but we should make it repealable or we should make it go away over time, which prevents like issues with like laws that last forever and they're bad. And there's a lot of really good evidence that says when you adopt something, it must be last forever and it can never go away, which which causes like some issues, and the counterplan would just do the plan, but it can go away. Additionally, there could be picks out of like singular assets. You could say we can do a wealth tax except on stocks, for example, and then you have the stocks DA as a net benefit. But I think these arguments might not be super strategic because, as you saw on the first slide, there's a lot of cards that say things like wealth tax doesn't have to be on all assets, it can just be on some assets, which means like the counter plan is probably a way to do the plan, which justifies like perm do the counter plan, which I also think Om was talking about when he said you should really practice competition on this topic because the neg will probably read a lot of uncompetitive counter plans, which you can deal with. Okay, what questions does everybody have on the counter plans? Okay. Uh, you go to the next. Okay. I think this is the one of the last things is critiques. I think talked about like critiques that can talk about like what wealth is that you can read on the AF. And as usual, the critiques that people are reading on the AF will be similar to the critiques that people are reading on the negative. I think one of the best critiques on this topic is the settler colonialism critique. It says that like things like redistributing wealth from the top of the most wealthy to those who like do not have wealth is bad because it assumes that like wealth is something that we should be allowed to redistribute. It questions what wealth is. For example, should wealth be like is wealth money? Is wealth land? Critiquing ideas of what we think wealth are might be really strong critiques of this topic. Additionally, there's this Wilmot 22 evidence. I think basically everyone on the circuit has been reading this evidence at the Florida Blue Key tournament, and I've seen other people also cut this piece of evidence. It says that a wealth when we pay taxes, it assumes that when we pay taxes, it assumes that the government we are paying the taxes to is legitimate. Why should indigenous people be forced to pay taxes to a government that like does not legitimate, probably like the government that stole their land? This is a really strong critique of the topic. Additionally, there's the cap K or the idea that the AF is like capitalist. And there's good evidence that's like there might be a revolution now because people are unhappy with the government increasing inequality. But once people see a wealth tax, they'll think that the government is like helping people out, and they might stop their revolutionary struggles against capitalism. And you read arguments about like capitalism might cause extinction, or it might turn structural violence afts, like things like racial cap, etc. Additionally, if you guys debated the living wage topic, there's a lot of similar critiques as the living wage topic. Things like critiques of care, critiques of redistribution. Basically, everything from that topic is still applicable because its core ideas and the tenets of why we do it are still the same. Especially things like critiques of growth, like the degrowth K, the Mbembe K that we saw that like people read on that topic might still be really good. Anyone have questions about critiques? Okay. Okay. Um, okay. So the last thing here is like philosophy arguments. And I think so Ohm talked about Kant, and I think Kant on this topic is actually very good, not just for the half, but also for the neg. So in the bottom right corner, you see this card, the R Minetto card. It basically says that when companies have wealth and they earned it fairly, they should be allowed to use it however they want, which just because they have a right to freedom. Look, I think the negative side of Kant would just be instead of having an omnilateral will where the government should be allowed to should be allowed to like unjustly tax people, people should be like free, fully libertarian, and they should be allowed to have like a right to do whatever they want. And taxes hurt that because they take people's fairly earned money. Another argument is the constitutionality NC. So the argument essentially is that a wealth tax is unconstitutional because there's a quote in the Constitution that says there can't be a quote direct tax on people, which is a tax directly on how much wealth you have instead of like the income you earn each year. And so the argument is that since something is unconstitutional and the resolution is a question of what the government can do, that is unethical for the government to violate its own constitution. This can also be offense under something like a contracts NC, where you can make the argument that a wealth tax, where the government is a contract, the Constitution is a contract, implementing a wealth tax would violate the contract because you're changing the Constitution, because you're violating a past part of the Constitution. It could also be Kant offense because Kant thinks that lying is bad. It's a promise. And if you break a promise, that's bad because it's like lying. And your argument would just be that when you change when you're breaking the Constitution is a promise, that's bad. The last argument is the Hobbes NC. Essentially, what Hobbes says is that humans are all like inherently evil and they all fight each other. And when there's a government, the government decides morality, and like there's what's called the sovereign, who is like kind of like a dictator who controls everyone else's ethics. And the argument is that a wealth tax would be bad for the sovereign to do because it would violate like a necessary right for equal taxation, which everybody should have. And that instead we should have income taxes because they're specifically proportional to how much income we have compared to like total taxes. Okay, I think that's it. Okay. That's it for the presentation on the next section. If anybody has any more questions, you can ask them now on like the app side or the next side or anything in general on the topic questions you have. What's the impact to the stock market TA? Okay, so the impact to the stock market TA, there's a few of them. I think one, okay, and then Hobbes and C, I'll explain it too. So first, stock market TA, the argument is that a stock market collapse would destroy the economy, and when the economic, it could be an internal link to just a normal econ DA, or you can read it as its own DA. You would just say a stock market collapse would cause like a broader recession, for example, like it would cause like a financial crisis, and the next financial crisis would be uniquely bad because the economy isn't in a bad position right now. Oh, and I also missed one question earlier. Oh, yeah. And then you said for Kant, what's the difference between F and neg? So the Kant argument, Kant is just like an ethical theory. So you'd have the same framework. You'd say the same idea like Kantian ethics are true. The AF would say that Kantian ethics that freedom requires a government that takes actions to like help everybody, and that the government has a positive obligation for us to be able to like help the poor. The negative would say the government doesn't have positive obligations. It should only choose not to violate other people's freedoms, which means the government should only not violate other people's freedoms, and taking wealth from people would violate their freedom to do things. Hobbes and C. I'm sorry because I don't have really great knowledge of what Hobbes says. I think the basic argument is just that is that everybody under Hobbes's government has a right to equal taxation because they gave their rights to the sovereign, and the sovereign therefore has to treat everyone equally, I think. I also think you should ask Vic that because he would answer that better. If a political party passes a wealth tax, Okay, if your argument is wait, are you talking just to clarify, are you talking about like how Kamala Harris says she'll pass the wealth tax? Well, she even if she wins the election, she's not going to be able to pass the wealth tax until after the topic is over. So it'll probably be fine. If they do pass the wealth tax, I actually do not think the topic would run properly because the whole argument is that a wealth tax should exist. If it ends up passing, then what would probably happen is you just say the status quo is good, and the neg would say that we should repeal the wealth tax, but it would be a little weird. Yeah. Anybody else? Um, okay. If that's it, thank you everybody for coming. Do you have anything to say?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, if you guys don't have any other questions, thank you all for coming. And this video was recorded if you ever want to look back. Remember what Vikrant and Om said if you forgot some parts of it or didn't take notes, and I'll send the link to the recording in the Slack in a couple of days. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. Wow, these kids really hate me. That's crazy.
No, no, no. Oh, how do I end this recording? Hold up.